The bright morning sun streamed through the windows of Riverside Middle School as Alex, a bright-eyed 12-year-old boy with dreams bigger than the sky, walked through its doors for the first time. His backpack was filled with freshly sharpened pencils, crisp notebooks, and endless possibilities. The halls buzzed with the excited chatter of students returning from summer break, their voices echoing off the freshly polished floors. Alex had always been a standout student, taking after his mom, who worked as a special agent with the FBI. At his old school, his teachers had praised his quick mind and endless curiosity. His favorite subject was science, and he'd spent countless hours at home conducting experiments in the kitchen, much to his parents' mixed amusement and concern. He even won first place in last year's district science fair with his project on renewable energy. This morning felt different, though. His regular science teacher, Mr. Roberts, was out sick, and a substitute teacher named Mrs. Wells would be taking over the class. As Alex walked into the science lab, he could feel the butterflies in his stomach doing somersaults. The room smelled of cleaning supplies and chalk dust, and sunlight caught the dust particles floating in the air, making them dance like tiny stars. He chose a seat in the front row, eager to make a good impression. His mom always said first impressions matter, and he wanted to show his new teacher how passionate he was about science. As he arranged his textbook and notebook on the desk, other students filtered in, filling the room with the squeaking of chair legs against the floor and the soft thud of backpacks being dropped. Mrs. Wells walked in exactly as the bell rang. She was a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she made her way to the front of the class. She didn't smile as she wrote her name on the board in precise, angular letters. As the class began, Alex's hand shot up repeatedly, eager to answer questions about cell structure and mitosis. But each time, Mrs. Wells's eyes seemed to slide right past him, calling on other students even when he was the only one with his hand raised. At first, he thought maybe she just hadn't noticed him, but as the pattern continued, a heavy feeling started to settle in his stomach. When he finally did get called on, his answer was spot on, but Mrs. Wells' response made his cheeks burn. Well, she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. Isn't that surprising? The way she said it made it clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. Throughout the class, Alex noticed other small things that made him increasingly uncomfortable. When he asked for clarification on the homework assignment, Mrs. Wells sighed heavily and said, "I thought I explained it clearly enough for everyone to understand." When he accidentally dropped his pencil, she made a show of stopping the entire lesson until he picked it up, commenting on how some students seemed to have trouble with basic classroom behavior. By the time the bell rang, Alex's enthusiasm had dimmed considerably. As he packed up his things, he could hear some of his classmates whispering. A kind girl with glasses gave him a sympathetic look, while others just looked uncomfortable, quickly averting their eyes when he glanced their way. Walking home that afternoon, Alex's footsteps were heavier than they had been that morning. The excitement of starting a new school had been replaced by a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He wasn't sure what he had done wrong, but Mrs. Wells's treatment made him feel small and unwelcome in a way he had never experienced before. As he approached his house, he debated whether to tell his parents about what had happened. His mom had always taught him to stand up for himself, but this felt different. Would anyone believe him? Would speaking up make things worse? Still, as he turned his house key in the lock, he knew he couldn't keep this to himself for long. Something wasn't right, and his mom had always said that staying silent in the face of wrongdoing only allowed it to continue. Little did Mrs. Wells know, her actions that day would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just Alex's life, but the entire school system's approach to ensuring fair treatment for all students. Would you like me to continue with part 2? The next few days in Mrs. Wells' class felt like walking on eggshells for Alex. Each morning, he'd sit at his desk hoping things would be different, but the unfair treatment only got worse. When he turned in his homework, she'd flip through the pages with a suspicious look, as if she couldn't believe he'd done it himself. "Did someone help you with this?" she'd ask loudly, making other students turn and stare. During group work, Mrs. Wells would always make comments that left Alex feeling isolated. When other students wanted to partner with him because they knew he was good at science, she'd suggest they might want to choose someone else who could actually help them. Some of his classmates started avoiding working with him, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't want to attract Mrs. Wells's negative attention. One particular Tuesday changed everything. Alex had spent the whole weekend preparing for his presentation on renewable energy, the same topic that had won him first place at his old school's science fair. He'd made colorful charts, brought in a small working solar panel, and even prepared a demonstration with a mini windmill he'd built himself. As he stood in front of the class, his heart pounding but determined to do well, Mrs. Wells started interrupting him every few sentences. "Speak properly," she'd snap, even though he was speaking clearly. "Are you sure you understand what you're saying?" she'd ask with a smirk, even when he was explaining complex concepts perfectly. What Mrs. Wells didn't notice was that in the back of the class, one of Alex's classmates, a quiet kid with round glasses, had their phone propped up against their textbook, recording everything. They'd seen enough of Mrs. Wells's behavior over the past few days and decided someone needed to document what was happening. That evening, Alex finally broke down at dinner. The pasta on his plate went cold as he told his parents everything. The constant dismissal of his raised hand, the suspicious questions about his work, the humiliation during his presentation. His dad listened with growing concern, but his mom, the FBI agent, had a look he recognized, the same one she got when she was piecing together clues in a case. "Why didn't you tell us sooner, honey?" his mom asked gently, placing her hand over his trembling one. "I thought maybe I was imagining it," Alex replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Or that if I just tried harder, worked better, she'd treat me fairly." His mom's face softened with understanding, but her eyes held a determined glint. "You know what we say in our family about standing up to wrong things." Alex nodded, remembering their family motto: "Silence helps the wrong side." The next morning, while Alex was at school, his mom started making calls. She wasn't just an FBI agent. She was a mother bear protecting her cub. She reached out to other parents, and slowly, more stories started emerging. She discovered that 3 other families had already complained about Mrs. Wells's behavior, but their concerns had somehow gotten buried in administrative paperwork. What really changed the game was when Alex's classmate's parent reached out, mentioning the video their child had recorded. "My kid felt awful about what was happening," they explained. They wanted to help, but didn't know how, so they decided to document it. When Alex's mom watched the video, her hands clenched into fists. There was no denying what she was seeing: her son, trying his best to give a scientific presentation while being repeatedly interrupted and belittled. The looks on the other students' faces in the background told their own story: discomfort, confusion, and sympathy. That evening, as Alex did his homework at the kitchen table, his mom sat down beside him with a determined look. "Tomorrow," she said, "things are going to change." She explained that she'd scheduled a meeting with the school board, and this time, they wouldn't be able to ignore what was happening. Alex felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He was scared about what might happen next, but looking at his mom's confident face, he knew he wasn't alone in this fight. Sometimes, he realized, standing up for what's right meant being brave enough to let others help you fight your battles. Would you like me to continue with part 3? The next morning dawned with a tension in the air that felt almost electric. Alex's mom had spent the entire night preparing for the meeting, gathering evidence, and making sure every detail was documented. She'd put on her most professional navy blue suit, the one she wore for important FBI meetings, and there was a quiet determination in her steps as she walked into Riverside Middle School. The school's main office was buzzing with unusual activity. The principal, the school board members, and even the district supervisor had all gathered for this emergency meeting. Mrs. Wells sat in one corner, looking less confident than she did in the classroom, her usual smirk replaced by a nervous frown. Alex's mom walked in last, carrying a thick folder of evidence. She'd learned through her FBI work that preparation was everything. Inside that folder were printed copies of Alex's previous academic records, testimonies from other parents, and most importantly, a USB drive containing the video of Mrs. Wells's behavior during Alex's presentation. "Before we begin," Alex's mom said, her voice calm but firm, "I want to make it clear that this isn't just about my son. This is about every child who has ever felt diminished in a place where they should feel safe and encouraged to learn." The room fell silent as she started presenting her evidence. First came Alex's previous academic records: straight A's in science, math competition victories, science fair wins. Then came the sudden drop in his grades, but only in Mrs. Wells's class. Other parents' complaints followed, showing a pattern that couldn't be ignored. But it was the video that changed everything. As it played on the conference room screen, the room grew increasingly tense. They watched as Alex tried to give his presentation, his voice clear and knowledgeable, only to be repeatedly cut off and belittled. The looks of discomfort on his classmates' faces were clear as day. Mrs. Wells tried to interrupt, claiming the video was taken out of context, but Alex's mom held up her hand. "I'm not finished," she said firmly. "As an FBI agent, I've learned to follow the evidence, and the evidence here is overwhelming." She then revealed something that made Mrs. Wells's face turn pale: a history of similar complaints from 3 other schools where Mrs. Wells had previously taught. Somehow, she'd always managed to transfer before any serious action could be taken, but not this time. "Our children come to school to learn, to grow, to believe in themselves," Alex's mom continued, her voice growing passionate but controlled. "When an educator abuses their position of power to diminish a child's spirit, they're not just failing at their job, they're causing harm that can last a lifetime." The school board members exchanged concerned looks. The district supervisor was taking rapid notes. The principal, who had initially seemed defensive, now looked deeply troubled. Mrs. Wells attempted to defend herself, claiming she held all students to high standards, but her words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. When she tried to suggest that Alex was too sensitive, Alex's mom cut her off with a look that had made hardened criminals confess. "High standards?" she questioned. "Is that what you call publicly humiliating a child? Questioning his abilities based on nothing but your own prejudices? Making him feel unwelcome in his own classroom?" The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, the decision was unanimous. Mrs. Wells would be immediately removed from her teaching position, and a full investigation into her teaching history would be conducted. The district supervisor announced that mandatory sensitivity training would be implemented for all staff members. As Alex's mom walked out of the school building, her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "How did it go?" She smiled, typing back, "Justice was served, honey. Things are going to be different now." On her drive home, she reflected on how this experience would change not just Alex's life, but potentially the lives of countless other students. Sometimes, she thought, the most important cases weren't the Bay FBI investigations, but the battles fought in small conference rooms, standing up for what's right, one child at a time. Would you like me to continue with part 4? The news of what happened in that conference room spread through Riverside Middle School like wildfire. When Alex walked into school the next morning, something felt different. Students who had previously stayed quiet now came up to share their own stories about Mrs. Wells. The hallways buzzed with excited whispers, and even teachers stopped to give Alex encouraging smiles. The kid who had recorded the video, the quiet one with round glasses, finally introduced themselves properly to Alex. "I couldn't just watch it happen," they explained during lunch break. "My grandpa always says that doing nothing when you see something wrong is the same as saying it's okay." That simple act of recording had helped bring about real change, and a new friendship was born. Mr. Roberts, the regular science teacher, had returned from his sick leave and was shocked to hear what had happened in his absence. He made a special point of welcoming Alex back to class with genuine warmth. "I've seen your previous work," he said, his eyes twinkling with enthusiasm. "I can't wait to see what you'll contribute to our class discussions." But the changes went far beyond just one classroom. The school board had taken Alex's mom's words to heart. They launched a new anonymous reporting system where students could safely report any unfair treatment. Posters went up in hallways encouraging students to speak up against injustice. "Your voice matters," they read, and for once, it felt true. During morning assembly, the principal addressed the entire school. Without mentioning specific names, she talked about creating a safe learning environment for everyone. "Education is about lifting each other up," she said, her voice carrying across the auditorium. "When one of us is treated unfairly, it affects our entire school family." Alex's story had started conversations in other classrooms too. In social studies, they discussed historical figures who stood up against discrimination. In English, they read stories about courage and speaking truth to power. Even in math, their teacher took a moment to talk about how everyone deserves a fair chance to learn and grow. At home, Alex found himself becoming more confident. The weight that had been pressing down on his shoulders was gone. He started eating dinner with his family again, sharing stories about his day with genuine excitement. His mom noticed how his eyes had gotten back their spark, and how he'd started conducting his kitchen experiments again. One evening, as Alex worked on his science homework at the kitchen table, his mom sat down beside him with a thoughtful look. "You know," she said, "sometimes the hardest part of fighting for justice is taking that first step of speaking up." She pulled out a letter she'd received from the school board. They were implementing new training programs for teachers, and they wanted her input based on her experience in promoting fairness and equality. "Your story helped change things," she continued, watching as Alex solved a complex chemistry problem. "Not just for you, but for other kids who might have faced similar situations in silence." Alex looked up from his homework, thinking about everything that had happened. "Do you think Mrs. Wells will learn from this?" he asked quietly. His mom considered the question carefully. "I hope so," she replied. "Sometimes people need to face consequences to understand the impact of their actions. But the most important thing is that the system is changing to protect students like you." That weekend, Alex's parents helped him set up a more advanced home science lab in the garage, a reward for his courage in speaking up. As he'd arranged his new beakers and test tubes, he overheard his mom on the phone with another parent from the school board. They were discussing ways to make the new reporting system even better, to ensure no student would ever have to face what he did. Looking at his reflection in one of the glass beakers, Alex saw someone stronger than before. Not just because he had stood up for himself, but because he had helped create change that would protect others too. His mom had taught him that justice wasn't just about fixing one wrong, it was about making sure that wrong couldn't happen again. Would you like me to continue with part 5? The following weeks at Riverside Middle School felt like watching flowers bloom after a long winter. The science classroom, once a place of anxiety for Alex, had transformed into a hub of excitement and discovery. Mr. Roberts had divided the class into research groups, and for the first time, Alex found himself surrounded by classmates who were eager to work with him. One morning, something unexpected happened. The district supervisor visited their class to announce a new science program they were launching. "We're creating a student council focused on making science education more inclusive," she explained. "And we'd like Alex to be one of our founding members." The whole class erupted in applause. Alex felt his face grow warm, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from pride. His friend with the round glasses, who had recorded the video, gave him the thumbs up from across the room. They too had been invited to join the council. During the first student council meeting, Alex was amazed to see students from all grades sharing their ideas. One girl talked about starting a lunchtime science club where older students could help younger ones with their projects. Another suggested creating a science fair specifically focused on solving community problems. What happened with Mrs. Wells wasn't right, Alex said when it was his turn to speak. But look at what came from it. We're here, planning ways to make things better. Maybe that's the best revenge, turning something bad into something good for everyone. At home, Alex's mom couldn't have been prouder. She'd started receiving emails from other parents whose children had similar experiences in different schools. They were asking for advice, for guidance, for help in making their children's voices heard. She created a simple guide for parents, sharing what she'd learned from their experience. One evening, as Alex worked on his proposal for the science club, his dad brought in a letter that had arrived. It was from the state education board. They wanted to use Riverside Middle School's new reporting system as a model for other schools in the district. Alex's case had sparked a movement much bigger than anyone had expected. The changes weren't just on paper. You could feel them in the hallways, see them in the way students interacted with each other. When a new student joined their class mid-semester, looking nervous and unsure, Alex was the first to welcome them. He remembered how it felt to be uncertain, to wonder if you belonged. During a parent-teacher conference, Mr. Roberts shared something that made Alex's parents beam with pride. "Your son hasn't just improved academically," he said. "He's become a leader. When he sees someone struggling, he helps them. When someone has a question, he takes time to explain. He's turning his experience into a way to lift others up." Alex's mom used her FBI skills to help the school create a thorough background check system for substitute teachers. "Prevention is better than cure," she explained during a school board meeting. "We need to stop these situations before they start." The most surprising change came from Alex himself. One day, during dinner, he announced that he wanted to start a blog about his experience. Not to shame anyone, he explained quickly, seeing his parents' concerned looks, but to help other kids know they're not alone. To show them that speaking up can make things better. His mom listened thoughtfully, then shared some wisdom from her years in the FBI. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices," she said. "But those voices need to be brave enough to speak, and smart enough to speak with purpose." That night, as Alex lay in bed, he thought about how different things were from just a few weeks ago. The fear was gone, replaced by something stronger. Hope, mixed with determination. He realized that sometimes life's hardest moments could lead to the most important changes, not just for yourself, but for others too. Would you like me to continue with part 6? One sunny Tuesday morning, Alex's mom received an unexpected phone call that would make the impact of their story even bigger. A local news reporter had heard about the changes at Riverside Middle School and wanted to feature their story. Not to focus on the negative parts, but to showcase how one brave voice could lead to positive change in an entire school system. At first, Alex was hesitant about being interviewed. "What if people think I'm just trying to get attention?" he asked his parents during breakfast. His mom smiled knowingly. "Sometimes," she explained, "sharing your story helps others find their courage. Remember how alone you felt at first? Maybe someone else feels that way right now." The reporter visited their home on a Saturday afternoon. She sat in their living room, listening intently as Alex and his mom shared their experience. They talked about the hard days, but focused more on what came after: the new reporting system, the science council, the changes in school culture. Alex's friend with the glasses joined them too, explaining why they decided to record that crucial video. "What made you finally speak up?" the reporter asked Alex. Alex thought carefully before answering. "I realized that staying quiet wasn't just hurting me," he said. "It was letting someone think it was okay to treat any student that way. My mom always says that change starts with one person being brave enough to tell the truth." The story aired the following week, and the response was overwhelming. The school's phone lines were flooded with calls from other schools and districts wanting to learn about their new policies. Parents reached out sharing similar experiences, thanking Alex and his mom for showing them a way to fight back against unfair treatment. But the most touching responses came from other students. Letters and emails poured in from kids who had faced similar situations but hadn't known how to handle them. Some shared how they'd used Riverside's story to push for changes in their own schools. Others simply wanted to say thank you for showing them they weren't alone. During a special assembly, the principal announced that their school's new policies would be implemented across the entire district. She invited Alex to say a few words. Standing at the podium, looking out at all the faces, some familiar, some new, Alex felt a surge of confidence he'd never known before. "When I first faced unfair treatment," he began, his voice clear and strong, "I thought I had two choices, either accept it or fight alone. But I learned there's always a third choice, standing up together. One voice becomes many voices, and many voices can change things." The Science Council was flourishing too. They'd started a mentoring program where older students helped younger ones with their projects. Alex especially enjoyed helping new students feel welcome in the lab. He remembered how it felt to be afraid in science class, and he was determined to make sure no one else had to feel that way. His mom had been busy too. She'd worked with the school board to create a simple, effective guide for other schools dealing with similar issues. "It's like solving a case," she explained to Alex. "You gather evidence, build support, and work towards justice. But this time, we're preventing problems before they start." One evening, as Alex worked on his science fair project in the garage lab, his mom brought him a letter. It was from Mrs. Wells. She had written to apologize, saying the incident had made her reflect on her behavior and seek professional help. While Alex appreciated the apology, he realized something important. This story wasn't about Mrs. Wells anymore. It was about how standing up for what's right can create waves of positive change. That night at dinner, Alex's dad raised his glass in a toast. "To my son," he said proudly, "who taught us all that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared." Would you like me to continue with part 7? Spring was in full bloom when Alex received an invitation that made his heart skip a beat. The State Education Board wanted him to speak at their annual conference about student rights and school safety. The theme was creating safe spaces for learning, and they thought Alex's story perfectly captured what they wanted to achieve. His mom helped him prepare his speech at their kitchen table, the same place where he'd first found the courage to tell her about Mrs. Wells. "Just speak from your heart," she advised, watching him practice in front of their refrigerator. "Your truth is powerful enough." The conference hall was packed with educators, administrators, and students from across the state. Alex spotted his science teacher, Mr. Roberts, sitting in the front row, giving him an encouraging nod. His friend with the glasses was there too, along with several members of their science council. Taking a deep breath, Alex stepped up to the microphone. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was steady. "6 months ago," he began, "I thought being brave meant facing problems alone. Today, I know that real courage is knowing when to ask for help, and then using that help to make things better for others." He shared how the incident had transformed not just him, but his entire school. The new reporting system had already prevented several similar situations. The Science Council was thriving, with students from different grades working together. Most importantly, students now felt safe speaking up when something wasn't right. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he continued, remembering those difficult early days. "It happens one conversation at a time, one person standing up, one school making better rules. And then, like a science experiment, it spreads and grows until it becomes something bigger than we imagined." After his speech, a line of people waited to talk to him. One principal shared how she'd already started implementing similar changes in her school. A student council president asked for advice on starting their own reporting system. A teacher with tears in her eyes thanked him for helping her understand how to better support her students. Back at school, things had settled into a new normal, but it was a better normal. The science fair was approaching, and Alex's garage lab had become a popular spot for study groups. Students who once struggled with science were now excitedly sharing their project ideas. His mom's guide for handling unfair treatment in schools had gone viral online. Schools across the country were downloading it, adapting it to their needs. She'd even been invited to give training sessions to teachers and administrators about creating inclusive classrooms. One afternoon, while helping a younger student with their science project, Alex overheard something that made him smile. Two new students were talking about how welcome they felt at Riverside Middle School. "It's different here," one said. "People actually care if you're treated fairly." That evening, Alex added another entry to the blog he'd started about his experience. He wrote about how sometimes the worst moments in life can lead to the best changes, not just for yourself, but for others too. His blog had become a source of support for students facing similar challenges, offering hope and practical advice. His mom, reading over his shoulder, squeezed his shoulder gently. "You know," she said, "in my FBI work, we talk about leaving a legacy, making things better for those who come after us. You've done that here, honey. You've changed things for the better." Looking around his room at the science fair ribbons, the thank you letters from other students, and the certificate from the State Education Board, Alex felt a deep sense of peace. The scared boy who once dreaded going to science class was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and more determined to help others. Would you like me to continue with Part 8? As summer approached, Alex's story took an unexpected turn when a national education magazine featured Riverside Middle School's transformation. The article highlighted how one student's experience had sparked a movement that was now helping schools across the country create safer learning environments. The magazine piece caught the attention of a well-known children's rights organization. They reached out to Alex and his mom about starting a nationwide student advocacy program. "Your approach of turning negative experiences into positive change is exactly what we've been looking for," their email said. One warm afternoon, while Alex was tutoring younger students in his garage lab, his mom came in with exciting news. The organization wanted them to help create a student-led support network. The idea was simple but powerful. Connect students who had faced unfair treatment with others who had successfully overcome similar situations. "Think of it like a science experiment," his mom suggested. "You had a hypothesis about speaking up making things better. Now we've proven it works, we can share the formula with others." The program started small, with weekly online meetings where students could share their stories and get advice. Alex's friend with the glasses helped set up a secure platform where students could connect safely. They called it Students Supporting Students, or SSS for short. During one memorable session, a student from another state shared how she used Alex's story to convince her school to change their policies. "I kept thinking, if he could do it, so can I," she said, her voice full of pride. Now our school has a student rights council too. The impact spread beyond just schools. Local community centers started asking Alex to speak to their youth groups. His message was always the same. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And when you speak up for yourself, you're speaking up for others too. His mom's FBI background proved invaluable in helping schools develop better screening processes for teachers. She created a simple checklist that helped administrators spot potential red flags during hiring. "Prevention," she would say, "is always better than dealing with problems after they happen." One day, while working on a particularly tricky chemistry experiment, Alex got a surprise visit from his old friend, the student who had recorded the video of Mrs. Wells. They hadn't seen each other much since middle school started, but their shared experience had created a lasting bond. "You know what's crazy?" his friend said, adjusting their glasses. "That video was just me trying to help one person. But look what it turned into." They gestured around the garage lab, where younger students were busy with their projects, all feeling safe and supported. The school year was coming to an end, but the changes they'd started were still growing. The Science Council had expanded to include students from other middle schools in the district. Their reporting system had been adopted by schools in 3 different states. And most importantly, students everywhere were learning that they had the power to make things better. During the last week of school, Alex received a letter that made him emotional. It was from a student he'd never met, in a school hundreds of miles away. "Your story helped me find my voice," the letter said. "Yesterday, I spoke up about something unfair happening in my class. Today, things are already starting to change." That evening, sitting in his favorite spot at the kitchen table, Alex looked at his mom with tears in his eyes. "Remember when I was scared to tell you about Mrs. Wells?" he asked. "I never imagined that speaking up would help so many other people." His mom smiled, remembering how far they'd come. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the bravest thing we can do is share our story. Because somewhere out there, someone else needs to hear it." Would you like me to continue with part 9, the final part? 1 year had passed since that first difficult day in Mrs. Wells's class. Now, on a bright morning, Alex stood in front of Riverside Middle School, helping to hang a banner for their first annual Speak Up, Stand Together conference. Students and teachers from schools across the state were coming to learn about creating positive change in their own communities. The school gymnasium had been transformed into a conference hall. Display boards showed the journey from that first incident to the nationwide movement it had become. The Triple S program now had chapters in over 50 schools. Alex's friend with the glasses had created a special presentation showing how their small actions had created big ripples of change. "You know what's amazing?" his mom said, helping him arrange chairs. "This all started because you were brave enough to tell your story at our kitchen table." She was scheduled to give the keynote speech about turning difficult moments into opportunities for positive change. During the conference, students shared their own stories of transformation. One girl talked about how her school had adopted the reporting system after facing similar issues. A boy described how the Science Council idea had inspired them to create student support groups for all subjects. Each story showed how Alex's experience had helped others find their voice. Mr. Roberts, who had become one of the school's most beloved teachers, led a session about creating inclusive classrooms. "Sometimes," he said, "the best lessons we learn in school aren't from textbooks. They're from standing up for what's right." The most touching moment came when a surprise video message played on the big screen. It was from Mrs. Wells. She had completed a year of sensitivity training and was now working with teacher training programs, sharing her story as a warning about the harm prejudice can cause. "I learned my lesson," she said, "and now I'm dedicated to making sure no other teacher makes the same mistakes." During lunch break, Alex overheard 2 visiting students talking. "I can't believe all this started because one kid spoke up," one said. "Makes you wonder what changes we could make at our school." It was exactly the kind of conversation he'd hoped the conference would inspire. His mom's FBI colleagues had even gotten involved, helping create guidelines for schools to handle discrimination cases properly. In law enforcement, his mom explained to the audience, "We protect people from harm. But sometimes the most important protection starts in our classrooms." As the conference drew to a close, Alex stood up for one final speech. Looking out at the crowd, he saw faces full of hope and determination. "A year ago," he began, "I thought I was alone in my struggle. Today, look around. None of us is alone anymore. We've built something bigger than ourselves." He paused, remembering that scared boy who once dreaded going to science class. "Change isn't always easy," he continued. "But when we stand together, when we speak up for what's right, we can transform our worst moments into our greatest achievements." The applause that followed wasn't just for Alex. It was for every student who had ever felt afraid to speak up, every teacher who had learned to be better, every parent who had fought for their child's rights. It was for the power of one voice to start a movement that could change thousands of lives. That evening, as Alex and his family cleaned up after the conference, his mom found a note left on one of the chairs. It read, "Thank you for showing us that our voices matter. Because of you, I know I'm not alone, and I'm not afraid anymore." Alex pinned that note to his bedroom wall, right next to his first science fair ribbon. It was a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage, and that speaking up for what's right can create waves of positive change that touch lives far beyond our own. The end. Would you like me to help you with anything else?